Welcome back. In this lesson, we are going to create a trigger to invoke our pipeline at regular interval. To create a trigger, you've got a couple of options. The first one is you can come into the pipeline that you want to be triggered and click on Add Trigger and then click on New/Edit. And if there are triggers, you can select them. But there are no triggers here. So you can click on New to clear a new trigger. So that's one option, but that is a shortcut rather than the home for the trigger. Let me show you where the triggers normally live, and that is under the Manage Hub. And when you've created a trigger, you're going to see all of them listed here. As we don't have any triggers, we're not seeing anything. But you can click New here, and that gives you the same screen that we saw previously to create the trigger. So this is the home for your triggers, so I'm going to name my trigger as TR_NYC Taxi Data Load. And let's now talk about that type of triggers. So there are 4 different types of triggers available at the moment. And they are scheduled triggers, tumbling window triggers, storage event triggers, and custom event triggers. Scheduled triggers basically run on the wall clock. You specify when you want your triggers to start. And then how often do you want event trigger? Different tumbling window triggers are run on an interval, so you specify your start and end, and then it'll repeat that start and end. So for example, if you wanted to grab data for every 6 hours that you specify, your interval is 6 hours and then you specify the start date. There are no overlaps allowed, so it'll have to be the exact 6 hours period to be repeating that. And they are slightly more sophisticated than the scheduled triggers. It allows you to create dependencies as well. And also you can pass in the start date and the end date of the window into your pipelines and work on that as well. So for example, if you want to go and grab data from an Oracle or a SQL Server database using those dates, which is the interval, you can pass that along and then you can grab the data for that intimate storage event. Triggers works on the Azure storage, so that can be based on a blob or a container being created or deleted. So when you create a blob or you delete a blob, then you can invoke a pipeline from that. Custom events works based on events being pushed into event grid, so the Synapse pipelines can subscribe to the topics in your event grid. And when an event arrives, you can trigger the pipelines based on that for this exercise. So let's use a scheduled trigger. But if you want to learn more about tumbling window or the storage event triggers, please see the Microsoft documentation or look at our Data Factory course. So let me select the scheduled trigger. The start date by default is populated with the current UTC time. So my time here at the moment is this one. So I'm going to say I want the trigger to run at this time. So by the time I would have created the trigger and I can see that running. So that's what I'm going to do. So that'll be 15. And I'm going to go first 0 seconds there and let me click. Okay. And I'm going to change the UTC time zone. Okay, so that's this one. So that's my current time zone, and I can now specify how often I want my trigger to run from that point on. But I can say I want the trigger to run every 15 minutes, or I can say I want the trigger to run every month, for example. So let's leave it at 15, and you can specify an end date as well. I don't want my trigger to be running all the time, so I'm going to record the course for the next hour or 2, and then I'm going to stop. So I'm going to just pick this time. So after that the trigger ends and there won't be any new pipelines being triggered, and you can specify whether to start the trigger on creation or you go manually and click on a button to start the trigger. I'm going to say I want to click on the button to trigger the trigger, start the trigger. So let me just click OK here. So the next thing we need to do is, now that we've got a trigger which is going to run from 315 for every 15 minutes, I want to associate the trigger to a pipeline. So let me go to Integrate Type. And we want this pipeline to run based on the trigger. So I'm going to add a trigger to this pipeline, and you can again click on New/Edit, but now this time you should see a trigger. So when I click on the Choose Trigger, I'm seeing a trigger which is the one we created, and that is this trigger. If you want to make any changes, you can do that. But again, you've got the option to start or leave it stop. Let's leave it stopped and let's click OK and click OK again. And as it said on the last clean, I don't know whether you've noticed, until you publish the trigger to the Synapse repository, it's not going to run. So let's go to the Manage Hub again and let's see the trigger. As you can see here, we've got the status is stopped and it's got one related object, which is our pipeline. If you click on that, it'll show you that trigger is going to trigger this pipeline. You can have multiple pipelines being triggered from a scheduled trigger, but that's not possible with the tumbling window trigger. So let me click. Okay, and I'm going to click on this button to start the trigger. So now the trigger is started. But when we say the trigger has started, it means nothing. Basically, it doesn't really start to run the trigger until you publish it. So once you published it, the trigger is going to be effective. It's going to come in and run. But if you don't want the trigger to run anymore, then you can go and click on this stop button and stop it again. At that point in time, you will have to go and publish it, otherwise it doesn't take effect. So please remember this: until you publish the changes, the trigger won't run. So let me click Publish All and click Publish. And it is being published. So what we'll do is we've got another 15 minutes. So we'll come back in 15 minutes to see whether the trigger has run through. We'll do that in our monitor. And that we will do after 15 minutes. So guys, I will pause here for 15 minutes and then I will come back and we will verify the execution. So let me go to Monitor Hub now. As you can see here, the trigger has completed and it succeeded. So when it succeeded, all it's done is invoke the pipeline. If you look here, the pipeline will be running now. So as you can see, the pipeline running is completed. So if there are any failures, the trigger run would still say that it succeeded because it's done its job. But the pipeline run is the one which we'll have to look at. So the pipeline has now successfully completed, as you can see in this case for the PL execute all pipelines, and triggered by you will have the name of the trigger rather than manual trigger. That's the difference. So this one was triggered manually and this is triggered by our trigger that we created. So this is how you can create a trigger to automate your workloads. We've got to get to be running every 15 minutes, but you don't need to do that in this case, actually, because we expect the data to be monthly. We can run the trigger every month as well if you wanted to, or you can do it at a different interval as well. So there is a lot of flexibility within triggers to be able to deal with scheduling our workloads or scheduling our pipelines. So that's the end of this lesson. I hope you've got a good understanding about Synapse factory pipelines and triggers and how to use them.